Sandra's day had been long, but she was finally on her way home to her family. The warm glow of the setting sun painted the sky as she drove through a quiet suburban street, only minutes away from her house. She obeyed every traffic law, but the sudden flash of red and blue lights in her rearview mirror made her heart sink. Officer Blake, a cop with a reputation for targeting black drivers, pulled up behind her and signaled her to stop. Sandra took a deep breath, kept her hands on the wheel, and waited. She had nothing to hide. Blake approached her window with a scowl. "License and registration," he barked. Sandra complied immediately, retrieving her documents with steady hands. "May I ask why I was pulled over, officer?" Her voice was calm, respectful. Blake scoffed. "Reckless driving," he said without hesitation. That didn't make sense. She had been driving at a steady speed, signaling every turn. But she knew better than to argue. "I don't believe I was reckless, but here's my information," she said, keeping her tone even. Blake barely glanced at the documents before shoving them back at her. "Step out of the car." Sandra hesitated. "Officer, I don't understand. Am I being detained?" Blake's eyes darkened with irritation. "I said, step out of the car," he snapped. Sandra's pulse quickened. "I'd just like to understand." Before she could finish, Blake yanked open the door and grabbed her arm. The sudden force made her gasp. He pulled her out roughly, nearly making her lose her balance. "Hey! You don't have to do that!" a voice called out from a nearby parked car. A bystander had started recording the interaction, their phone camera locked on Blake's aggressive behavior. Sandra winced as Blake's grip tightened. "I'm not resisting," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Blake ignored her. "Turn around. Hands on the car," he ordered. She had done nothing wrong. No speeding, no reckless driving, just a cop abusing his authority. But with her children waiting for her at home, she couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Gritting her teeth, she turned and placed her hands on the car. But Blake wasn't done. The air was thick with tension. Sandra could feel the weight of every set of eyes watching the scene unfold, bystanders on the sidewalk, a few drivers who had slowed down, and most importantly, the person recording with their phone. Blake's anger hadn't subsided. "Why are you resisting?" he spat, even though Sandra wasn't resisting at all. "I'm not," she said, keeping her voice as steady as possible. "There's no reason for this." Blake wasn't listening. With a sudden burst of aggression, he reared back and delivered a hard punch to Sandra's face. A collective gasp rippled through the small crowd. Sandra staggered backward, her head spinning from the blow. Pain shot through her cheek, and she barely had time to process what had just happened. "Hey! What the hell is wrong with you?" someone shouted. The bystander's phone caught everything: the unprovoked attack, the way Sandra's body crumpled, the horrified reactions from those who had witnessed it. Sandra's knees hit the pavement, her hands trembling as she reached for her face. Her vision blurred with tears, both from pain and shock. She had heard stories of police brutality, had seen videos of incidents like this before, but never in her life did she think she'd be the one on the receiving end. Blake, however, wasn't finished. "Get on the ground!" he yelled, as if she wasn't already there. He yanked her hands behind her back and slapped handcuffs around her wrists. "You're under arrest for resisting," he announced smugly, as if that would somehow justify what he had done. More people had gathered now, murmuring among themselves, their faces a mixture of rage and disbelief. Some continued filming. Others called out in protest. A man in the crowd stepped forward. "You just hit an unarmed woman for no reason. You're in trouble, man." Blake didn't even look at him. He called for backup, still convinced he had total control over the situation. But what he didn't know was that Sandra had just made the most important phone call of her life. As she sat on the pavement, handcuffed and bruised, she looked Blake dead in the eye and whispered, "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." Her husband was on his way. And he wasn't coming alone. Sandra sat on the curb, her hands still cuffed behind her back, her cheek throbbing from Blake's punch. Her mind raced with a mix of emotions, rage, humiliation, and an unshakable determination. She had done nothing wrong, yet here she was, treated like a criminal. Blake stood over her, arms crossed, radiating smug satisfaction. He had no idea who she was, no idea what was coming. "I want my phone call," Sandra demanded, her voice steady despite the pain. Blake rolled his eyes. "You can call whoever you want when we get to the station." A bystander stepped forward, phone in hand. "She doesn't need to wait. I'll let her use mine." Blake hesitated. The growing crowd was already against him. Denying her a simple phone call would only make things worse. With an exaggerated sigh, he snatched the phone from the man and shoved it towards Sandra. "Make it quick," he snapped. Sandra took a deep breath and dialed. The call barely rang before a deep voice answered. "Marcus," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need you." There was a pause, then a deadly serious response. "Where are you?" Sandra lifted her head, locking eyes with Blake as she spoke. "I was just assaulted by a police officer. I'm handcuffed on the side of the road." The line went silent for a beat. Then Marcus spoke again, his voice low, controlled, and laced with fury. "I'm on my way." Sandra could hear the urgency in his tone. He wasn't coming alone. Blake smirked. "Who'd you call? Your boyfriend? Think he's gonna come save you?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you have no idea how this works." Sandra didn't answer. She just stared at him, expression unreadable. Meanwhile, the video of her assault had already started making waves online. Witnesses were sending the footage to news outlets, tagging civil rights groups, and flooding social media with outrage. Blake thought he was untouchable, but his actions were already unraveling beyond his control. He had no idea that in mere minutes, everything would change. Blake had spent years feeling invincible. His department had always covered for him, brushing aside complaints and dismissing excessive force allegations. Tonight felt no different. But then, the sound of tires screeching against the pavement made his stomach drop. Several black SUVs pulled up to the scene. The doors flew open in unison, and out stepped a team of federal agents, their dark suits unmistakable. At the front of the group was Marcus Carter, towering, composed, and seething beneath the surface. Sandra's husband. Blake's smug grin disappeared. Marcus moved with purpose, his sharp gaze locked on the officer who had dared to put his hands on his wife. He reached into his pocket and produced his badge, flashing it just inches from Blake's face. "Special Agent Marcus Carter, FBI." His voice was cold, his expression unreadable. "And you just assaulted my wife." Blake's mouth went dry. The other officers on the scene stiffened, suddenly realizing the gravity of the situation. The usual playbook, cover-ups, excuses, and shifting blame, wasn't going to work this time. One of the FBI agents turned to the nearest patrol officer. "Hand over all body cam footage. Now." Another retrieved the bystander's phone and began reviewing the video. As the footage played back, the moment Blake's fist connected with Sandra's face, her body crumpling to the ground, the smug look on Blake's face, everyone knew there was no way out for him. Blake tried to speak, but Marcus cut him off. "You're done." His voice was so calm, so measured, that it was terrifying. "You laid hands on an unarmed woman. You fabricated charges. And you thought no one would hold you accountable." Blake swallowed hard. His confidence was gone. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the weight of his own actions finally catching up to him. One of the FBI agents turned toward the ranking officer on the scene. "We're taking over from here. This is now a federal investigation." Blake took a step back. "Wait, hold on. You have the right to remain silent," another agent said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. For the first time in his life, Blake was the one being restrained. As the cold metal snapped around his wrists, the reality hit him like a ton of bricks. His department wasn't going to save him. No excuses would get him out of this. The man he had laughed at, the man he had mocked as just some boyfriend, wasn't just any man. Marcus Carter was his worst nightmare. Blake had spent years believing he was above the law. But now, as cold steel wrapped around his wrists, reality came crashing down. "You have the right to remain silent," the federal agent recited, securing the cuffs tightly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Blake barely heard the rest. His heart pounded in his chest. He glanced around, expecting someone, anyone, to come to his defense. But his fellow officers stood still, their faces unreadable. There was no attempt to justify his actions, no quick cover-up. They had seen the video. They knew. The crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers. Bystanders who had witnessed the assault, who had feared this moment would end with another black woman unjustly harmed, finally saw justice unfolding before their eyes. "That's what you get," one man shouted, clapping his hands. "About time," a woman added, shaking her head. "Thought he was untouchable." Blake's mouth opened, but no words came out. He turned toward his superior officer, a desperate plea in his eyes. "Yes, sir, But the man simply shook his head. "Get him out of here." The humiliation burned deeper than anything Blake had ever felt. He had arrested countless people, taken pleasure in exerting his authority. Now the roles were reversed, and he couldn't stomach it. Meanwhile, Sandra sat in the back of an ambulance as a paramedic examined her. Her lip was swollen, and her cheek bore the imprint of Blake's knuckles, but she remained composed. Marcus stood beside her, his protective stance unwavering. His rage had been immense, but now, as Blake was shoved into the back of a patrol car, a sense of justice settled over him. One of the federal agents approached. "Agent Carter, your wife is free to go. We'll be pursuing multiple charges against Officer Blake, including police brutality, excessive force, and violation of civil rights." Sandra exhaled, feeling the weight of the moment. "Thank you." The agent nodded, his expression firm. "He won't get away with this." Marcus placed a hand on Sandra's shoulder. "He never stood a chance." As the police cruiser carrying Blake pulled away, the crowd continued to watch, their phones still recording, their voices still buzzing with energy. The story was already spreading, an officer abusing his power and facing real consequences for once. Sandra wasn't naive. She knew justice wasn't always served, that countless others had suffered at the hands of officers like Blake with no accountability. But today, for once, the system had worked in her favor. And Blake? He was finally experiencing what it felt like to have his freedom stripped away.